Welcome back, friends. Today is a very important session because in exam at least 4 questions come from this area. And today we are discussing post-structuralism. So let's decode a big turning point in literary theory, post-structuralism. It first took shape in France during the late 1960s as a reaction against structuralism, which had been the dominant way of thinking for a few decades. Now, structuralists believed that language and cultural systems had deep, universal structures that we could uncover, but post-structuralists weren't convinced. They said, wait a minute, language isn't a clear window to reality. Instead, it's a closed system, a kind of code. Words don't carry meaning on their own. They only mean something in relation to other words. Pause here and note this down. This is the heart of Saussure's idea of difference, expanded by thinkers like Jacques Derrida. For Derrida, meaning is never stable. It keeps sliding, always deferred. That's why his method of deconstruction became so central. Now, here's the golden trick. Post-structuralism doesn't just question language. It also challenges the binaries that structuralism relied upon. Nature versus culture, male versus female, speech versus writing. Post-structuralists argued that these categories are not natural truths, but cultural constructions shaped by ideology and power. Can you recall what this means for reality itself? Exactly. Our very sense of reality is not direct or pure, but mediated through discourse. In simple terms, what we think of as truth is always constructed. This is why post-structuralism resists fixed interpretations. A text doesn't have one stable meaning waiting to be uncovered. It has multiple shifting, unstable meanings. Subjectivity too becomes fragmented. The self is no longer a unified center of meaning, but a shifting position within language and culture. Here's something you'll love. Post-structuralism grew out of structuralism but refused its optimism. Structuralists believed that if we studied language deeply, we could understand ourselves and our world. Post-structuralists flipped that on its head. They said, no, language is not a tool we master. It masters us. And remember this, because it was asked in exam, post-structuralist critics warned against treating genres simply as discourse. Why? Because discourse itself has limits, and it always ties back to power and subjectivity. The influence of post-structuralism spread far and wide. In literature, philosophy, gender studies, and cultural theory, it opened the door to radical new approaches. Thinkers like Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Julia Kristeva, Jacques Lacan, Jean Baudrillard, Gilles Deleuze, Jean-François Lyotard, Pierre Bourdieu, Hélène Cixous, and Louise Irigaray each added their own twist, but together they dismantled the idea of stable meaning. Instead, they highlighted how meaning is always contingent, constructed, and shaped by power. So, if structuralism was about uncovering hidden structures, post-structuralism is about exposing the instability of those very structures. That's the essence of this movement. Let's decode one of the most exciting voices of 20th century theory, Roland Barthes. Born in 1915 and passing in 1980, Barthes was not just a literary critic. He was also a philosopher, semiotician, and a cultural theorist whose work shaped both structuralism and post-structuralism. Barthes challenged one of the oldest assumptions in literary study, that meaning comes from the author. Instead, he said meaning is produced by codes, interconnected systems in language and culture. And remember, this exact point was asked in exam. In his groundbreaking collection Mythologies, published in 1957, Barthes analyzed everyday objects, ads, fashion, wrestling matches, and showed how culture creates myths. These myths don't simply reflect reality. They disguise cultural values as if they were natural truths. Pause here and note this down. Barthes was teaching us to read the hidden layers of ideology in daily life. Can you recall his most famous essay? Yes, it's The Death of the Author, written in 1967. In this provocative essay, Barthes argued that the identity of the author should not control interpretation. Once a text is written, it belongs to the readers. Meaning emerges not from the author's intention, but from the reader's engagement with language. You'll love this part. Barthes also gave us fresh concepts, Writing Degree Zero, where he explored a neutral style beyond literary traditions, the effect of reality, which explains how texts create the illusion of truth. And in his study, SZ, he dissected a short story, not by chronology, but through narrative codes. Let's decode Roland Barthes' very first major book, Writing Degree Zero, published in 1953. Pause here and note this down. The publication year has been asked in exam, so make sure it stays fresh in your memory. Now, why is this book so important? Well, Barthes makes a radical move here. He says, look, writing is not just a neutral tool for expressing ideas. It's not simply language, which is a system, and it's not style, which belongs to an individual. Writing, or écriture, as he calls it, is something else. It's a conscious choice, deeply shaped by history and ideology. Every act of writing carries meaning beyond the words themselves. Can you recall who he critiques most sharply? Yes, the French socialist realists. Barthes believed they fell into a trap. By using old, conventional literary devices, they weakened their own revolutionary goals. He even remarked that nothing here is given without metaphor, that what he is consuming is literature. In other words, their writing was weighed down by ornament instead of breaking free. Now here's the golden trick. Barthes doesn't just criticize. He also points toward a new possibility. He praises writers like Albert Camus, especially in The Stranger, for creating a neutral, almost colorless style of writing. A writing stripped of unnecessary decoration, closer to raw human experience. He also admires Raymond Queneau for blending everyday colloquial speech into his prose. This, Barthes believed, was the path toward a freer form of expression, and guess who he pushes back against? Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre's narrative, according to Barthes, was weighed down by artificiality. Instead, Barthes imagines a utopian vision of language, what he calls an Adamic world, where words would no longer feel alien or burdened by history. A pure, unalienated language. Hold that thought, because this vision of Writing Degree Zero set the stage for Barthes' later works in semiotics and eventually post-structuralism. It's here that he first began questioning how writing itself is entangled with power, culture, and ideology. So remember, Writing Degree Zero isn't just Barthes' first book. It's the foundation stone of his entire theoretical journey. And yes, the year 1953 mark it, because it has been asked directly in your exam. Let's decode one of the most fascinating works of cultural theory, Roland Barthes' Mythologies, published in 1957. At first glance, this book doesn't look like traditional literary criticism. Instead, it takes everyday life, adds toys, wrestling matches, even celebrity culture, and asks a simple but powerful question. What do these things really mean? Barthes tells us that culture itself works like a language. Just like words, objects, and events carry hidden meanings. He calls these meanings myths, but not myths in the sense of ancient gods or legends. No, here myths are modern stories, cultural codes that sneak into our daily lives. An ad for soap powder, for instance, is not just selling detergent. It's also selling values cleanliness, purity, even morality. Pause here and note this down. Barthes defines myth as a depoliticized speech. Asked in exam, what does that mean? It means myth takes something political or cultural and makes it look natural, like plain common sense. In other words, myth hides ideology beneath the surface of everyday science. Now, here's the golden trick. Barthes builds this on Saussure's model of the signifier and signified, but he takes it one step further. For him, a sign can itself become a new signifier in a bigger system. Think of it like layers. A picture of a soldier saluting the flag is one sign. But when it's used in a magazine, it becomes a myth. It tells us about patriotism, loyalty, and national pride. The book is divided into two parts. First, Mythologies short essays that dissect examples like Einstein's brain or soap powders and detergents. Second, Myths Today, a theoretical essay that explains how myth functions in culture. Together, they form a powerful framework. Culture is not innocent. It encodes ideology. So next time you see an ad, a film, or a news story, pause and ask, what hidden myth is being sold here? That's exactly what Barthes wanted his readers to discover, the secret language of modern life. Let's decode one of the cornerstones of structuralist narratology, Roland Barthes' essay, Introduction to the Structural Analysis of Narratives, published in 1966. This text is a game changer because it gives us a systematic model to study stories not just as entertainment but as coded systems of meaning. Pause here and note this down. Barthes offers a three-tiered framework for analyzing narratives: functions, actions, and narration. And this has been asked in exam. At the base level, we have functions, the building blocks of any story. Barthes divides them into 4 types. Cardinal functions are pivotal events that move the plot forward. Catalyzers are smaller details that support those big events. Indices give psychological or symbolic hints, while informants set the scene with time, place, or context. Can you recall where this comes from? Yes, Barthes is adapting Vladimir Prop's study of Russian folktales, but stretching it to apply to all kinds of narratives. The second level is actions. Here, Barthes talks about actants. Notice, he doesn't mean characters as deeply psychological individuals. Instead, they're defined by their roles in the structure: desire, opposition, mediation. In other words, it's not who they are, but what they do in the story that matters. Finally, the third level narration is about the telling itself. Whose voice speaks? From what perspective? Under what conditions is the story being told? This ties narrative analysis directly to discourse, just as linguistics looks at how language works in use. Barthes argues that narratives are like language. Each part only has meaning in relation to the whole system. That means stories generate meaning not just through their content, but through the structure, the way their elements are organized. This structuralist approach was revolutionary. Instead of asking, what does this story mean thematically? Barthes asked, how is meaning produced through its structure? That marked a decisive shift from interpretation to formal analysis. And the impact? Huge. His essay influenced not only literary theory, but also semiotics and cultural studies, paving the way for critics to read literature as a network of signs and codes. So, next time you think about narrative, remember Barthes' 3 levels: functions, actions, narration, because this framework remains a cornerstone of modern literary criticism. Let's decode one of the most influential essays in literary theory, Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. First published in 1967 and later included in his collection Image Music Text in 1977, this essay changed how we think about literature forever. Now pause here and note this down because it was asked in your exam. Traditionally, critics relied on the author, his life, passions, and intentions to find the meaning of a text. But Barthes challenges this idea. He boldly declares that to give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text. In other words, when we tie meaning only to the author, we are shutting down the infinite possibilities hidden in the text. Can you recall why Barthes saw the author as more than just a writer? Exactly, he argued that the figure of the author was tied to capitalist ideology, glorifying the individual as the sole source of creativity. And this was also asked in the exam. By dethroning the author, Barthes makes space for the reader because a text's unity lies not in its origin but in its destination. That destination is the reader's interpretation. Barthes believed that every text is not a single voice but a tissue of quotations. He drew on Mallarmé's idea that it is language which speaks, not the author. Texts are woven from culture, history, and countless prior voices, not born from one original genius. Think of Proust's narrative techniques or Balzac's Sarracine, where a man unknowingly falls in love with a castrato. These works show how identity and meaning slip and slide beyond the control of any author. Pause here because another key fact was asked in exam. This same book also contained Barthes' essay From Work to Text, which built on the same ideas. Together, these essays stress that meaning isn't fixed at the point of writing, but constantly reshaped at the point of reading. And don't miss the subtle link. Walter Benjamin once observed that all real stories must have something useful. Barthes connects this tradition to his critique of author-centric criticism, showing how cultural expectations shape what we think a text should mean. So, by declaring the death of the author, Barthes didn't kill literature, he actually liberated it. He invited readers like you and me to embrace multiplicity, to reinterpret narratives again and again, and to see literature not as a closed box but as an open field of possibilities. Let's decode one of Roland Barthes' most famous works, SZ, pronounced SZ. Published in 1970, it sits right at the turning point between structuralism and post-structuralism. Here, Barthes takes Balzac's short story Sarrasine and examines it line by line, not to find out what Balzac meant, but to show how meaning itself is generated through codes. Pause here and note this. This is where Barthes shifts from seeing texts as fixed systems to seeing them as open and plural, full of possibilities. Instead of looking at the author or the simple storyline, he says, look at the codes that create meaning. Now here's the golden trick, and this has been asked in exam. Barthes makes a distinction between readerly and writerly texts. Readerly texts, like those of George Eliot or Arnold Bennett, are straightforward. They guide the reader step by step, making meaning clear and leaving little room for questioning. The reader is passive, just receiving the story. In contrast, writerly texts are the complete opposite. They are playful, ambiguous, and experimental. They force the reader to actively participate, to become a co-creator of meaning. Think of James Joyce's Ulysses or Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. They don't hand you the meaning. You have to work for it. And now, something else you must not miss again. Asked in exam, Barthes lays out 5 narrative codes that shape every story. Let's pause and break them down. First, the proairetic code, also called the action code. This drives suspense and momentum. For example, if a gunslinger pulls out his weapon, you already expect a shootout. Second, the hermeneutic code or the enigma code. This is about mysteries, delays, and unanswered questions that make you keep reading, just like in detective novels where clues are withheld. Third, the symbolic code, which works through oppositions like male and female, inside and outside, life and death. A great example is the jump cut in 2001, A Space Odyssey, where a bone thrown by an ape suddenly transforms into a spaceship. It's a symbolic leap from primitive tools to futuristic technology. The other 2 codes, the cultural code and the semantic code, also play a role, but in SZ, Barthes highlights especially the first 3. So, what's the big idea here? Barthes is saying that reading isn't just consuming words on a page. It's decoding a system of signs, clues, and references. Meaning doesn't belong to the author, it emerges in the interaction between text and reader. Now here's the takeaway you'll love. SZ turns reading into a dynamic process. Instead of looking for one truth or one message, you start to see reading as an adventure of possibilities, shaped by culture, language, and your own engagement as a reader. Let's decode one of Roland Barthes' most influential essays, From Work to Text. And pay close attention here because this has been asked in the exam. Barthes begins by making a sharp distinction between 2 things, the traditional work and the more fluid text. Think of a work as a finished object, neatly bound and complete. It has an author who is seen as the central authority, and it carries a fixed meaning tied to its origin, its history, and its form. The reader in this model is almost passive, simply receiving what the author intended. A work is like a polished product, consumed as something complete, Now here's the golden trick. Barthes flips this idea when he introduces the concept of the text. A text is not fixed, not singular, and not closed. It is dynamic, plural, and alive. Instead of limiting the reader, it invites participation and multiple interpretations. In this space, the author is decentered, no longer the master of meaning. Meaning arises only when the reader actively engages with the words. In other words, the reader is no longer a consumer but a co-creator. Pause here and note this down. The text is not about what it says, but about how it generates experience. Barthes even calls it a space of jouissance, a special kind of pleasure that comes from disruption, ambiguity, and discovery, rather than from neat clarity. Can you recall Barthes' famous distinction between readerly and writerly texts? Readerly texts are traditional, they guide you smoothly, asking for little effort. Writerly texts, on the other hand, are challenging, experimental, and playful. They demand that you reconstruct meaning. And this is where literature becomes an open field of possibilities, not a closed window to truth. Let's decode two fascinating works by Roland Barthes, both of them important for your exam. So listen closely and pause to note this down. First comes Empire of Science, published in 1970. Now this one has been asked in exam, so mark it as high priority. Barthes here does something unusual. He doesn't write a factual study of Japan. Instead, he creates an imagined, symbolic Japan, a space of difference. Through Japanese aesthetics like haiku, calligraphy, food rituals, even the idea of empty space, he explores how science can resist Western ways of making meaning. Pause here and think, what does it mean for science to resist? In the West, we often assume a sign points to some deeper truth, but Barthes' Japan is different. Here, signs float. They don't point to a center, they stay open, meaning is never fixed, it's deferred, unstable, and sometimes silent. That's why this book itself becomes a demonstration of semiotics. It invites us to value not the hidden depth, but the surface, the silence, and the evanescence of interpretation. Now, here's the golden trick. Barthes continues this exploration of ambiguity in The Pleasure of the Text, published in 1973, also asked in exam. This book dives into the experience of reading itself. He introduces two terms, plaisir or pleasure and jouissance or bliss. Pleasure comes when a text gives us comfort, when it fits our cultural codes and narrative expectations. Bliss, on the other hand, erupts when the text breaks those codes, destabilizes language, and unsettles our subjectivity. Can you recall what that feels like? Imagine reading a text that doesn't flow smoothly but jolts you, fragments you. Barthes calls this experience erotic, even ecstatic. It's the space of the writerly text, where the reader doesn't passively consume meaning but actively participates in its creation.